Greetings and welcome back to another edition of Perspectives. I am here this time to bring you my guest, Silas, who is going to be talking about Kenya, which is, of course, on the opposite end of Africa to Nigeria. It's be the third African country we're covering. And unlike the other two that have been covered, I've actually been physically visited Kenya. So there's a slight difference there, although it's been quite a while. And it is in East Africa, so different history, different languages, different people. As most of you, of course, know, Kenya, that general area, is likely the birthplace of humanity. Various proto-hominids and hominids existed there for millennia, if not millions of years. And at this point in time, Kenya is, I'd say, more stable than your typical African country, if you could use that term. So we're going to actually fast forward a little bit to the 19th century and start off, I think, with British Kenya, because that had obviously had a huge impact on the further development of the country. So, Silas, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thanks. Thanks. Sorry. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
So essentially, Kenya was a colony for almost 100 years, I think up until 1962, from the late 80s, 1888, if I recall right. What would you say the impact of colonialism in the case of Kenya has been? How did it shape Kenyan culture and society in general?
Well, thanks. I mean, I definitely want to reiterate the thanks again for having me on this. Long-time listener, and it's really an honor to be here
Uh,
for the
the,
Perspective
the
Talks.
honor is mine to have you. It's no
Yeah.
problem.
Thanks. Okay, so I guess we'll just jump right in there. See how this goes. With the colonialism aspect, this is one of the more contentious subjects that I think people who don't live in former colonies will say. With the media, they kind of just have this idea that colonialism was pretty much an entire negative. But
Uniquely bad among the bad things in history,
yes,
as it were. Yeah.
yes. But then you look at the actual countries, and I know correlation is not causation, but there's an interesting number of countries. The longer they were under colonization, the more stable they are today.
Mm,
And even accounting for, you also have to think which colonization, mostly with the British,
yeah.
which would definitely plays out in Kenya.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting observation you make, and I think obviously not very politically correct, but there's some anecdotal stories I hear that people comparing, obviously, from the west of Africa, places like the Ivory Coast when it was still under French colonial rule
Yeah,
versus Liberia, and you could just sort of the stories you read, you sort of walk across the border. In the case of the French colonial power area, Ivory Coast, there were roads, there were structures, and then you walked across to Liberia, and it was just it kind of looked like a bombed out shithole.
yeah.
So I think there's some truth to that. And uh, Kenya, 1962 isn't that long ago. So having that relationship there, and then even think about some famous British personalities off the top of my head. Well, in the sciences, Richard Dawkins was born in Kenya. I mean,
Yeah,
he's technically a Kenyan of some sort. And I believe David Attenborough as well, the
okay.
famous biologist. Well, so there's definitely probably my impression, based on what the limited knowledge I have access to on the topic, is that Kenya was in some ways more influenced colonially than a lot of other places. And if I recall, the breakaway wasn't. I mean, there wasn't as much hostility there. So compare some things that happen in places like Zimbabwe and what have you. So maybe we can talk about what the relationship is these days between the United Kingdom and Kenya, and just how things evolved during that period of moving away from colonialism.
Okay. Well, with the current relationship, of course, now the languages spoken, the main languages are Swahili and English, which is a situation where most of the people who live in the city will speak either two languages, their tribal tongue and Swahili, or in cases three languages, some English, the tribal tongue, and Swahili. So that definitely does play a big part, that English is an international language. So that kind of gives us a leg up on some of the countries in Africa. The culture is there too. Like fast food places, it's kind of like fish and chips places, but fish and chicken instead. And sports wise, of course, people follow the Premiership a lot more than they do the other sports. And people are just not that antagonistic towards quote unquote Mzungus, which is not, Mzungus is a Swahili term that they just call white people. It's just all white people in
Mm.
general called Mzungus. It doesn't matter what country they're from. It's just, I guess it would kind of just be like the blacks in the rest of the world. That's the term that they use for them there. But when it comes to the governmental relationships, I think there was still a lot of attachments with being one of the Commonwealth states. I'm not quite sure. I just found out, this shows how terrible my history and awareness of Kenyan activities are. But they kind of have a double Independence Day thing where they had one where it was freedom from colonization, and then there was one where the governors left. So they kind of have a dual Jamhuri Day and Madaraka Day. It's
Mm.
like free. I'm not quite sure what the differences between the two are, but that's something my parents kind of just indicated to me, and I was wondering why are we still doing this? It's kind of a double thing, and in that aspect, that's one of the frustrating things I see about the country is this whole thing of people just doing things because that's the way it's done. There's a very common saying that goes by in Kenya that when you're discussing issues and they just say Kini Kenya, they say that's Kenya, that's how it is, that's just what we do.
Mm.
It's very frustrating.
It kind of resonates with me. It's a bit cheesy. That line from Blood Diamond, when Leonardo DiCaprio is playing a Rhodesian, and something along that. I'm paraphrasing it. That's just Africa. It's all the problems. You just sort of assume
Yeah.
that's just the way it is. Now, I'm curious how familiar you are with the Mau Mau uprising, because this actually preceded uh, the independence of the Kenyan state slightly, and there were several thousand deaths involved. This was, if I recall right, a conflict between, uh, well, I suppose, for lack of a better term, the British or white settlers and
Yes.
certain, I guess, local tribes, the Kikuyu,
Yeah.
yeah,
Kikuris. Yeah.
yeah,
They would actually be considered, I think, they'd be the most visual of the freedom fighters during that time, the independence fighters.
mm,
Unfortunately, I do not know that much about them.
okay,
I do know there's still actual court cases that are, I think, just completed a few years ago where they were still kind of rectifying some of the abuses that occurred to the prisoners. I guess it was actually a war. It was a war of a kind. It was the prisons of war and the Mau Mau, the effect that the British had on them. And there's actually still some of them alive. There's still some that fought, and they had a contingent out in the UK, which again is another thing that we see about the UK that's different than many other countries is they actually are somewhat accountable to the sins of their past.
I suppose, but I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, like many conflicts, I mean, there are obviously war crimes committed by the British, but the Mau Mau, of course, committed crimes as well. It's rarely this singular,
Yes,
one-sided portrait that people tend to paint.
but that's the key there, the accountability. It's hard to hold.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
hard to
I think
hold the
it's
Kenyans
it's a lot
accountable for themselves.
harder. I mean, so you take one of the if you take some the massacre in that particular conflict of say the Lari, right? Uh, that was a Mau Mau massacre, but how do you hold these people accountable?
Yeah,
There's a some pervasive narrative when it comes to colonialism, particularly in Africa, that remains intact today. You look at a place like Zimbabwe with Mugabe. I mean, the country is just fallen apart over the last couple of decades, and at the same time, it's somehow still the fault of the white man slash the colonial powers. But you seem to be intimating that Kenya is perhaps not completely, but largely free of that perspective. You're more tolerant of the. Sorry, what's the term for white people again?
Muzungu.
Muzungu. Yeah, the
Yes.
Muzungu. So, um, but I mean, if we fast forward to the present a bit, the first time I visited Kenya was in '89.
Mhm.
I mean, it's only about 3 weeks, so it's hard to remember a lot. There, it seemed okay, although it certainly was a contrast to Europe that I had come to know in the United States. A lot more poverty, visible signs of diseases related to poverty, like elephantitis
Yeah.
and tuberculosis and things like that. But I mean, how is it these days? Has for example, let's look at internet access and things of that nature. How prevalent is that?
Okay, that's actually a good jumping point to mention this. I also went to Kenya for the first time, 88, 89.
Okay, interesting.
My parents were working for the Kenya government. So I was born in France, moved back to Kenya, and lived there for the 5 years between 89 and 94. And oddly enough, as you mentioned, Zimbabwe, I remember as a kid, back then you're getting TV shows and information from kind of years back and very limited amount of information. So we're getting stories about America and Zimbabwe. Those were the two countries my parents were going to be posted to. And
Oh,
I remember sitting with my older brother, and from the information we've seen, we actually wanted to go to Zimbabwe a lot more than we did to the United States.
hmm.
You know, you're seeing kind of videos of those old racist videos with a KKK. You think you'll arrive in America and they'll be burning crosses in your yard, and you'll have those huge cars with the wooden paneling. But that at that point, Zimbabwe was kind of a jewel of Africa. I would say. I think it was being touted as one of the bright
In '89,
spots.
I don't know. I mean, I think they ever
Uh,
since Mugabe took over, I think they've objectively, economically, they've had problems. But I
yeah.
certainly could see it from a PR perspective.
Yes.
It might have looked good. Yeah.
I mean, that's definitely what me and admittedly, we were 10, so
Yeah.
I don't know how good we were thinking. I think one of the keys was we looked at the price of a PlayStation in Zimbabwe versus a PlayStation in
Right.
America at that time,
Right. Well,
or it was some gaming system. But um, yeah, so then I left the country for um, about, let's say, 16 years before I went back, and that was time spent in the States and another stint back in Italy. Um, and getting back was amazing. The changes that have happened there, it's really hard to explain. It's like one corner, you'd see just massive slums. Kibera slums is it's the biggest slum in the world. About 1 million people live in there, and it's kind of smack dab in the middle of Nairobi proper. Um, Yet you also have like a Rolls Royce Phantom or a Bentley. I don't know which car that is. Not too good at cars. But you have a car driving by that costs probably as much as half the houses in this slum of 1 million people. Yet you won't see this whole idea that poverty develops crime and angst and depression and anger. It's not the case because those people walking by, I don't know if they're just unaware of the actual worth of that car, but you never see them just have this irrational.
So are you saying that the level of crime there isn't particularly pronounced, especially things like vandalism and theft and robbery?
Um, to an extent, yes and no. It's normally it stays within the community. Like they'll commit crimes. Like I remember leaving when I left. You'd still have newspapers with people having tires burnt on them. The necklacing thing that.
Oh, right. So
Uh,
yeah, this is a common, I guess you want to call it judicial practice throughout Africa.
it was actually it was invented by Winnie Mandela, Nelson Mandela's
Yeah,
wife.
it's actually originally, I believe, a South African
Yes.
export,
Yeah.
and now everyone's decided to get in on the fun and action.
Well, yeah, it made its way up there. And one thing I tell people is the same group of people that will go out and vote in droves for a politician that siphons billions of shillings, which is, if you want to think of what like a shilling, pretty much 100 shillings is a dollar. That's just a general estimation to have. It fluctuates between that. But the politician will siphon off billions of shillings, and somebody will steal like a sack of potatoes, and that person who steals a sack of potatoes in some situations could get lynched, so could get beaten or rocks thrown on them. In some extreme cases, if somebody assaults someone, they can actually have the necklacing, which is not something that happens I mean, I can't remember the last time it happened, but this was talking in the past. But that's kind of to show that people kind of have an awareness of what their world is, and they kind of keep it within the family. I think that probably runs more to do with like the tribal aspect of it, where you have your closer community and you police yourselves within the community. And I don't know if it's a lack of awareness of the general actual effect of billions of shillings being siphoned away from your community would actually have, versus knowing properly that if this person took this sack of potatoes or this chicken from someone else, they can relate to that in a different way. Um, so I don't know if that really answers your question. It's kind of rambled away from the question, but
Well, I
uh,
mean, if that's in fact true, then this would seem to differentiate it from places such as South Africa, where I mean, it's very dangerous to have any property or any sort of ownership of anything that might indicate that you have money or even middle class. I mean, carjackings, the robberies of homes and what have you.
yeah,
It's rampant there, and usually not always, but usually black and white. And that would and different and obviously, I guess what you're describing doesn't sound all that different from Nigeria in my talks with CS about it, in the
yeah,
sense that if you have sufficient status and station, enough money, and people know you, they're not going to grab you, off the truck and necklace you. It's
yes,
usually the poor people who, if you're sort of immune from that sort of thing, given sufficient money and status, then yeah, it's I'm just looking at what year is this? Like I'm looking at totals per capita for crime and homicide.
hmm
The most recent one would be 2011. Um, and no, can't really seem to find it. But I'm trying to find some stats on the rates in Kenya. But yeah, I mean, it's
that's
not.
that's another thing. Some of these things will go unreported. Some of these things, it's kind of a situation. I've been looking at the world in general. I think the world is getting safer. It's just we're hearing more about the bad things that
Oh
happen.
yeah, yeah. I mean,
It's an excellent thing.
part of that's a reflection of the way media works, of
Yeah,
course. It's so Kenya, according to this was based on 2008 data, isn't doing that bad. It seems to rank 33 in the world. Now, it could be worse. It could be, Uganda or Venezuela or Honduras or
yeah,
any of these places. So, but definitely, I mean, there's less overt violence, but because of access to mass media, it's just instantly ported across the globe the minute there's something.
yes,
I mean, a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, some guy hacked a bunch of people up with an axe in a train in Germany. Now, the
yeah,
only reason this was reported is because it was, unusual, but it's not that big a deal. No one died. He died,
yeah.
severe injuries. And, if you compare that with other places in sub-Saharan Africa, it's kind of nothing. But so there's a degree of sensationalism of this stuff. Um, as far as development is concerned, I mean, you said that there was a huge difference. Um, is it mostly a difference of wealth or just sort of worldly awareness? Or, I mean, because there was a period not too long ago where Kenya had undergone some instability
Yes.
in elections. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Okay, that was a last one is post-election violence in the 2007 elections.
Mm.
That was a contested election. It was between Raila Odinga and was it Uhuru Kenyatta? No, it was still Kibaki. It was still Mwai Kibaki at that time. Mwai Kibaki came back in. He was an incumbent, and Raila was from the Luo tribe, which is a neighboring tribe to the tribe I come from, the Luyas. And they're the general opposition. Kibaki was from the Kikuyu tribe, which is more situated um, in the central of the Kenya, where Nairobi, the capital, is. So they kind of were working in concert with the colonials, and they kind of inherited power, inherited a lot of the roles of power, at least from my understanding. Um, and with that, they were also closer to, of course, where the money was, where the education was. So a lot of more people in this community, just from, I don't want to say a leg up, but just this is just geographical luck kind of thing. They ended up sending their kids out to, I mean, pursuing education more, sending them out abroad. So now we're wondering, is it because they were more intelligent that they did this, or is it because they've traveled out, they've seen other things? And there's just different roles where now we have more access to information and time, and we're trying to piece through why these things come to be. But certain realities of what happened, so there's certain divisions in power. So that happened, and there was, I mean, it was unfortunate. Definitely thousands of people died. I'm not quite sure the actual figures. A lot of the people involved, actually, the current president and deputy president, they keep changing the term from vice president to deputy president, but they were actually some of the people implicated in an actual war crimes tribunal at the ICC, at the International Criminal Court.
Hmm.
And that court case came up even when they were running for president, for their current presidency, and when they actually got in, and then the cases end up being kind of dropped and moved. Um, but that situation was mostly in different areas where different tribes had kind of moved into the areas of that are in general um, the ancestral lands of the other tribes. So this has that caused I don't know if I actually witnessed it when I was in Italy at the time, and I was coming back to Kenya, just assuming that it was going to be a horrific, horrific situation, because as we discussed, the media covers it in an entirely different way. When you came back to Kenya and actually talked to people there and reconnected with people and have seen the after effects of it, there was a long time when there was 500,000 to a million people displaced because once these fights started breaking up, people, entire communities would kind of flood back to their ancestral lands, or some would kind of move back to places that had been displaced by government or other people and saying, okay, now we're demanding our lands back since we can't live there. And then now you have a long history of the government not necessarily giving out land deeds. Some places have land deeds. Some places say, okay, we have this ancestral ownership to this land. So it's just a mix of a bunch of things, and I don't know how well versed I would be to speak on the subject, but
Have you? I mean, CS has personally witnessed a lot of sort of eyewitness violence. He's seen people have horrible things done to them and killed and executed. I take it you haven't seen too much of that in Kenya yourself.
not necessarily. And this is another thing why I might not be really the best person to speak on this, being the locations I live in there. I live in a pretty good area. My parents did pretty well for themselves, and
So you're
it's
effectively the elite of Kenya.
I'd say possibly yes. I definitely don't have a typical, but I don't have a typical lifestyle anywhere because my life is just rather odd, which I like. But I wonder if it gives me kind of a better way to analyze some of these things. Like, I wonder, is it better to analyze these things like the Watcher? I don't know if you know Watu from the Marvel universe. It's kind of like
Yeah, yeah, I know him.
standing outside,
He
or
was displaced by Nick Fury. Well, Nick Fury was condemned to become him, if I recall.
okay,
But
good stuff. Yeah, so I sometimes I feel like that. Sometimes I remember going back, and one of my uncles was there's this thing called a chama, where it's kind of a group where people come together and go into business ventures, help each other out. If somebody gets hurt, they kind of put money together and do something, or they just start little things. It's kind of friendly societies, like before, because you don't have that establishment of insurance and public services from the government. So you kind of have to have these communal type things that are normally done on lines of familial bonds, clan bonds, etc. And they were talking about certain projects, and I was telling him about how I was actually heading back to the States to renew some connections with the people I grew up with since I went to middle school through college here. Um, and then he just says, "You're not Kenyan." And I looked at him and was like, I guess not quite, because like genetically I am of that tribe.
Hmm.
My passport, citizenship wise, I am Kenyan. Culturally, I'm the places I grew up, and
Hmm.
so I'm kind of external to some of these things, I'd
Would you
say.
say, and I get that feeling sometimes from CS as well. I mean, he's kind of assigned I would argue, an artificial burden because he's, you're of the Yoruba tribe and technically
Yes.
in Nigeria that he has to somehow, represent their interests, and using their in air quotes
Yeah.
or what have you. Uh, do people try to assign that sort of artificial responsibility to you as well as a representative of your particular tribe,
They
merely
do.
because you belong to it?
They do to an extent because there definitely are certain assumptions. It's the thing when people say, "Oh, I don't judge," or people do this. This is it's a very expedient way to get through life, you know? And especially in a place where you're still a lot closer to your actual ancestral beginnings and culture and foods. Um, there's one article I just posted in a blog where I was just telling people about this story. They don't understand how deep culture and tradition and tribalness is to these people. That in the northeastern part of the country, which is closer to Somalia, it's essentially a desert,
Hmm.
and almost every year there's drought and people die. And this is a news story, and you see these people climbing those trees, those trees where you normally see like giraffes and things like those, kind of going nibbling these tiny little leaves. So they're getting these small, these small beans off of the leaves, these small seeds, and then you have to boil these things for hours. First, you'd find water in the desert, boil them, get them out, dry them, grind them down, boil them again, and then make some kind of meal out of them, just some basic paste-like meal, and that's what they're eating. So now in Lake Victoria area, which you said you visited, where is my tribe's from, it's a very fertile area. Lake
Yeah.
Victoria is
Yeah.
one of the sources of the Nile, so very fertile area. A lot of tilapia is a basic fish that comes from the
Yeah,
area.
but I mean, I studied the ecology of there. There's some massive, I don't want to get too off topic. There's some massive ecological problems. If I recall, is that the fish that was artificially introduced?
No,
It
the
was
perch was
the perch,
artificial.
right? And it's really displaced the local ecosystem, which is pretty unique amongst ecosystems,
Yeah,
and kind of ruined a lot of uh, essentially the biodiversity of Lake Victoria. A
yeah.
separate topic, I suppose, but
And
yeah.
there's some fern has also creeped in now on top of the water and he's choking
Yeah,
it out. So it's
yeah,
like a
yeah.
double whammy out there. So yeah, pretty. I mean, we'll see how that pans out. But it looks pretty bad. But I think nature has its way of figuring its way around these things.
Let's
Um,
hope.
yeah. So they were sending fish from the Lake Victoria area to Northeastern to feed these people that were starving. And they just had this lady just skin and bones on TV, and she just straight up said, "We're not going to eat the fish. It's not in our culture. We don't eat fish."
Hmm.
they would they would rather die than actually eat something different. And I see an odd parallel with that with some places in the states in the Western world that seem to be holding on to certain cultural precepts of that are almost suicidal. They're ending
Yeah.
their culture by I don't know what reasoning, but that's just to show how I don't want to say divided, but how I don't know what the perfect term is, stuck in their ways, or um, how definitive some of these divisions are. How it's no, these this isn't a country united. These are separate people.
Well, I mean, isn't that a fundamental problem throughout Africa? I mean, once again, I think these days I'm most familiar, again, with Nigeria based on talks with CS and my own research. And yeah, I mean, there's so many different tribes. I think the largest concentration of tribes in Africa, the state of Nigeria is largely artificial because the people are just so divided. And I would imagine to a lesser degree that must be true of Kenya.
Yes, of
But
course, also a lesser degree because we haven't touched on this. There's so many things we can talk on this. The religious aspect, that's another, I'd
Yeah.
say, positive of the British influence or lingering influence. Positive, negative, you can take it as you want. But the Anglican Church is the main church, is the main Western religion practiced in Kenya. There definitely is a big contingent, 10% Muslim population that's coming in from Somalia in the north, in the northeast, and also Mombasa, the coastal area
Yeah,
where
I've been to
there's a lot of
Mombasa,
trade.
so it
Yeah.
think is historically has been Muslim.
Yes. So they're still there and they're in government, but and they definitely have been tensions with Al Shabaab's influence, the
Right.
horrible attack in Garissa. Westgate Mall, it's actually a story. I was at that mall 3 days, three days in the week before it happened. The day it happened, I was actually heading there, and my neighbor in the place I was living, he's Croatian of origin, but they had been living in the country for him and his wife had been living in the country, started a business. They've been living there for 7 years, and he left 20 minutes before, and one of his friends actually got shot in the leg in the Westgate Mall thing.
Hmm.
So odd thing is when that's happening, we're sitting there. It's a few kilometers away. It's in Westlands, which is one of the better suburbs. I mean, more upscale suburbs of the place. The mall was international standard, competitive, a mall you'd see anywhere. And this is happening, yet in the area, they still people are still shopping. People are still going to the thing. The area was completely cordoned off. Um, you just see all the news vans and all the people there. You watch the coverage on the news, and it seems like Kenya is just falling apart. Yet, as horrific as it was, they still were. Life was still going on, and I don't know if that's more about the place. I haven't really been that close to a terror attack of that scope in another country while it was ongoing. Um, but that was kind of an interesting thing for me to see how the people kind of went on with their life while that was going on, and just seeing how the media was covering it. And I think that's a thing we need to be cognizant of when we just look at what is said about other places. Just talking about that and then reflecting on how I thought America was going to be from the snippets of media I saw when I was 10. And I think
Well,
that's
I mean, when it comes to Africa, most people are just profoundly ignorant, and understandably so.
yeah,
Now, they're not ignorant in the sense that Africa is this paradise that's been completely vilified by mainstream media. But I mean, there are obviously a lot of problems in Africa. But your typical American hasn't spent much time outside of the United States. In fact, I remember when I first went to Europe by myself in my sort of midish, latish teens.
yeah.
I'd come back and people would ask me things like, well, do they have microwaves in Europe and things of that nature? And so people really weren't that in tune with stuff. But uh, I think I've mentioned this before, and I'm planning on making a video, as the world expands and everything is just available via a click of a button, it's so easy to inform yourself about this stuff. But what
yeah,
I'm pretty interested in here is the influence of the conflict of Somalia and Islam in general. As you pointed out, I mean, Kenya majoritarily is they're very passive and boring Anglican type of Christianity, but your neighbor, is vehemently Islamic, and there were some issues in Mombasa, if I recall, and I mean issues that are sort of involved that sort of relate to Somalian influence, I suppose, or Islamic influence within Somalia. I'm not sure if you're aware of that or knowledgeable, but if you are, I'd love to hear you talk about that.
yeah. They in Mombasa. Mombasa is pretty much through and through under. It's a Muslim city, I'd say. I mean, of course, there's definitely huge exceptions made since it's a port city and it's a tourist city. So I guess it would be more liberal Muslim city, but it's most of the people who are in government involved there are Muslim. A lot of mosques. I think I checked the figures, but I'm sure it's majority Muslim population. Um, and I think one thing that kind of I don't know if it helps, but it makes it different. To you can't just attack the country as Kenya because as we mentioned, as I discussed before, it's many different tribes
Mm.
that may completely disagree with what one tribe in power does. So that tribalism aspect kind of makes it harder, I think, to sell that this is one enemy that's attacking our one country. So in that way, there's that. But with Mombasa, I think there were some rumblings of them trying to get independence. Like I guess Quebec was it Quebec or somewhere in Canada?
Quebec,
Um,
yeah, Quebec, yeah.
yeah, they were trying to kind of break off and get their own independence and have their own system of governance. Um, I'd say that's one of the places where there are some Sharia courts. I don't hear of stories of hands being chopped off or anything like that, or
Mm.
anything stonings like you see in Somalia. But it's definitely a lot more moderate, I would say, with the practice of Islam in Kenya.
Uh,
Um,
well, I think this really shows you something, and something that Sam Harris talks about a lot. And I have mixed feelings, as everyone knows about Sam Harris, but
yeah,
there really are differences between the religions. I mean, you take something as sort of as passive as modern Anglican Christianity in the United Kingdom, and to whatever extent that's reflected in Kenya,
yes,
versus I mean, this is the funny thing. I mean, Turkey, with all the recent problem, this is the quote unquote moderate Muslim state, right? And
yeah,
you know, a coup going on, terrorism in Istanbul. It's a mess. I mean,
yeah,
ongoing wars on the eastern front of Turkey. So I think you could basically take any society, as bad as it might be, whatever the native levels of crime, and remove Islam, and you would just get a net improvement across the board. Even
that seems to be.
it's absolutely incredible just how deleterious and just destructive. I mean, look at Somalia. Look, I don't think Somalia would change to a paradise if it you sort of magicked away Islam. There would be a lot of problems and issues related to all sorts of things, but it still would be better.
Yeah,
It's always I find this is astonishing just
it's hard.
how negative the influence is of Islam, no matter what it might be. Yeah.
I think it was a Hitchens quote where he says, "Just name me something you can say a non-religious person can do in the name of their lack of religion, and then name me something that someone can do in the name of religion." And that's my main contention with it. Is not everybody has to act on everything that's allowed in that religion, but when the extreme quote unquote extremists I mean, why we even calling them extremists when the people who decide to read certain parts in a certain way and act on them,
Mm.
um, that religion seems to have some parameters for some really horrible things. I mean, I'm laughing here like it's not a laughing matter, but it's what is it Harris or also who said it's a uniquely bad idea in a group of really bad ideas.
Yeah, yeah, something along those lines. He got in trouble for that over a year ago now,
Yeah,
on Bill Maher. He used the term "the motherload of bad ideas," and I
yes,
suppose
that's it.
he wanted to say a motherload. But yeah, I mean, you can take any society, touch it with Islam, and it just becomes worse. And I mean, I don't want to change the topic too much. This is my concern with Europe, because it just Islam is sort of universally a net negative influence. Whereas I have no issues with. I mean, it doesn't interest me, but so something like passive, like Anglican
Yeah.
Christianity, whatever people want to do their thing. But yeah, this could seems to me a potential point of conflict in Kenya, if only because and if things never get sorted in Somalia, and that's the way it looks like, or
Yeah.
it'll be a long time, there'll be a perpetual kind of state of stress, uh, metaphorically speaking, between the borders,
Well,
and
not metaphorically. It's very literal.
well,
It's
yeah,
a
yeah,
real point of stress. And some things to discuss on that where they had these two massive camps. Again, world's largest slum, Kibera, is in Kenya, is in Nairobi. And that's about 1 million people. Then you count the other slums in the city, and you're figuring around 1.5 million people living in slums in the capital city of a developing country. Now, on the border of Somalia, there was two major camps, refugee camps, and these are actual refugee camps, not like the migrants going to Europe. These are actual people who, if they're back in Somalia, they're probably getting killed. Um, they were sitting in these camps, but then now these attacks. There was the Westgate attack I've told you about, the Garissa attack, which was planned by one student in Northeast. He let the people in, and they closed up the school. There was maybe two security guards, and they actually just went in there and they pointed at the Muslim people, the people who could read the Quran. They were allowed out, and they just massacred the rest of the students, and that was just horrific. Then there's been other attacks where it's like somebody just lobs a bomb, a grenade into some bar in Mombasa or in Lamu in the coastal area, or a couple of attacks at bus stations and things like that in Nairobi, a few in the smaller cities of the country. So there's that to deal with. So there was these 500,000 people in the refugee camps, and they just closed the camps about a year ago, and there was contention of, okay, Kenya, you can't close these camps. Like, where are these people going to go? But with 1.5 of your own people living in slums in your city, where are these people going to go otherwise? You're not going to put them into tribal lands where the country just came from having a huge issue with people being in ancestral lands of other tribes people. And these are open lands. You'll go there and just open space, but people have that kinship and attachment to these spaces. You can't just put these people in there. As we've discussed, some of them are like, no, we have to eat this certain way, we have to worship this certain way, we have to live in this certain kind of community, and that's not something that would really fit into just, okay, let's just put these people here. It's not fitting in anywhere. It's not fitting in Europe. It's not fitting in North America. There's actual cultural differences where we can't just ignore these just because we can have this conversation and look past these things and they don't have value to someone like me and you as much as they do to other people. But I think we also have to realize for some people it is life or death. They will kill for it. They will die. They will choose not to eat a fish because it's not in their culture and actually risk death, or they will actually kill somebody else by dint of them not just saying, yes, the way you live is the correct way to live. So that's a very real thing, and I don't quite know how it's going to be dealt with, which is an unfortunate thing to say, but
Well, my perspective is that, yeah, this degree of tribalism, you could argue it's more pronounced in various African countries, if only because there's so many tribes.
yes,
I don't see it going away. I mean, one of the things that alt-right loves to talk about is how sort of endemic and integral tribalism is to human beings. It doesn't necessarily make it a good thing. But I mean, you're kind of stuck in the middle of this, I imagine. So you belong to a certain tribe, right? But you don't view yourself in the context in sort of identitarian terms as a member of specifically that tribe,
no.
do you?
And I don't think, besides them looking at me and hearing my name, reading my name, they would really consider me part of that tribe. As I said with my uncle, he was quite quite easily said I wasn't Kenyan,
Right.
which if I'm not Kenyan, that's I'm also not Luya because I don't only eat those foods. I definitely don't speak the language. I can kind of understand it because kind of growing up, it was the language my parents would default into when they were saying something about us.
Right.
Kind of when they were, what are these kids doing right now? When we were present, they would kind of go into it. So I can pick up some general words and things, but I don't speak the language. As you've seen, I'm not as cognizant of a lot of the history that happens with the country. And with traveling around, one thing I've looked for is tried to find is consistency in my life. Tried to understand who am I, like what makes me me, what makes other people the way they are. Um, I used to wonder why I couldn't have that. I couldn't have that attachment to one place, or that this is my country, this is my people. And well, I hadn't really found people that grew up in the similar way that I did, that thought the similar way that I did. So traveling around more, going to this international school in Italy where I finished up my college, I met kids who, when they say, "Okay, where are you from?" I would say I was born in France, moved to Kenya, then moved to the States, and I was going to the school in Rome after going to school in West Virginia, which is a beautiful West Virginia in America. For those that don't know, is one of the quote unquote flyover states. It has a negative connotation of being kind of backwards, but I really like the place.
Mm.
Some places really reminded me of the countryside of Africa, except with tarmac roads and power lines and brick buildings instead of the mud huts that you'd see in some of the more rural areas. But salt of the earth people, but some people who had never really moved much in their whole life. Just like you discussed, the typical person hasn't left the country. Also, that's how it was. The typical people in Kenya hadn't left the village, and that was a similar thing you find in West Virginia. So when I just told them where I was from, that would be the entire conversation for the next couple of meetings. I got to the school in Rome and I talked to a kid who's just starting at freshman year. He's just maybe 19 and he's already lived in 5 countries. So that would just be a passe thing. And I kind of met people who had more of a similar background, kind of geographically and idea wise, who kind of had a more global idea of the world. And then the internet, finding people like you and other sources, of course, Sam Harris, those kind of people, where you're just getting all this information where you're understanding the world. And that's kind of made me understand that you don't have to, I don't have those feelings because I didn't live that life. So that's not necessarily me. It doesn't have to define me. Does that mean when
Well,
somebody
I
looks at me,
suppose to play devil's advocate here, and
yeah,
I can share that sentiment that you have there, is that people who subscribe to tribalism and think it's really important and sort of the be all and end all would say, well, maybe you don't, but everyone else would look at you and will do that. You know, you'll
yes,
always be signed as an East African or
yeah,
Kenyan, at least in some people's eyes. And
which I don't begrudge them either because I also am that to them in their world I am that, and
yeah,
that is part of who I am, and in a way it might not define me, but if it helps them define me in a certain way, then I can't really begrudge them. I'm not there to. Okay, with that, I think this is my kind of saying. I'd rather somebody look at me and assume something bad about me and leave me alone, be out of my life, than the people who look at me and assume something good and stay in my life like a parasite for a negative reason. And those are the people
uh,
I try to avoid a lot more. I mean, you have those are people you can only avoid because the other people leave. But I
well,
try.
I'm thinking more just about somebody sees you on the street, they have all kinds of assumptions,
Yes.
obviously.
No,
Yeah.
and that's exactly what I'm talking about. Like
Okay.
in Kenya, you'll go there and someone will be like, "You're my tribesman, so you should you should talk to me, or you should kind of relate to something. Like let's say I have this business idea, you should give me your ear, or why are you hanging out with that person of that tribe?" And it's more with I guess the older generation or people who've lived in the countryside because a lot of kids now have grown up in Nairobi in mixed tribal communities. They don't really speak their tribal tongues as much, so they're more Nairobian. They're more suburban, not suburban, more urban than they are
Mm.
rural. So they more define themselves as Kenyans than they do their tribe. Their tribe is more secondary to their definition, or it's further down the line to their
So
definition.
I suppose you're saying that there's kind of been a slow development towards a sense of nationalism as opposed to sort of tribal identity, sort of national identity.
Yes, which happens through information, which is why I think it might not be as bad. We might not have to wait that long. It still could be a generational thing, but generations are not that. It's not that long of a time when you look at the general scale of what's going on, and how freeing the actual ability of information is.
Mm.
A positive thing is having that shared language, having that English and Swahili that people can communicate in, because that's massive. One of the main stories I think I from the Bible that makes a lot of sense is the Tower of Babel. People were kind of building this huge structure, and then to punish them, to stop them from advancing, they spoke different languages. And if you can't understand each other,
Mm.
that's a massive, massive roadblock to anything.
Yeah, I mean, certainly having English, I've mentioned this in other videos for other countries as well, it's quite useful. But so do you, I guess, in light of this, could you say that you see some sort of possibility for I guess, a unified and less chaotic Kenya with fewer tribal conflicts and misunderstandings.
Yeah, I think there is. I think people in general. I don't know. Neil deGrasse Tyson was a lot more of a fan of him in the past. He's a little more fence sitting on certain topics. I think he should be more vocal on, but that's just me. He had one saying where he's talking about the government in general and them being anti-science, and then he said, "Remember that at the end of the day, they want things to work. So
Yeah,
they
I recall that
eventually,
statement. Yeah.
so they'll eventually kind of step out as long as you show them things are working." Now that's the way. That's one thing I would say is definitely there in Kenya. They will have these biases, as all people do. All animals, all life forms, thinking life forms, or cognitive life forms, the right term. But
Cognizant, perhaps. Yeah.
yes, so we have the ability to take in information, make a judgment, and kind of go. It's just expedient. But if somebody does that and it's their tribesperson and they treat them wrong, but somebody from another tribe comes with a product that they like, they'll go with the other tribe. But if it's a similar product, they'll probably go with their own tribesman. But once the other person has a better product, a better way of doing something, they'll adjust. And that's one thing that's very evident in Kenya. One big advancement I'd say that was in Kenya was this thing called M-Pesa, which is the mobile money, where most of the population in Nairobi, I'd say 80% has a phone. And now, since the banking system hadn't been set up, what they did was they had the phone lines where you could pay for things on your phones. Now, instead of finding how you'd send money miles away to the countryside before the road system was as built, I mean, it's definitely a lot more improved now. You just kind of put your money on your phone, walk to a kiosk, put your money on the phone, send it to your grandma's phone back home. She goes out and takes the money, or she can go directly to the store and pay for it with it. She could even actually just send you the pay bill number or the store number of where she is, and you can pay for it from Nairobi, hundreds of kilometers away, and she takes the goods away. Now that's a system that now they're actually doing loans through this banking system. Now the banks have come to work with the telecoms, and that's a system that started in Kenya that was now is kind of moving around the world. They tried this mobile money in America, I think years before, but the idea just didn't stick because people were also tied to, they were so used to cash, credit, or checks. Now, those are things that you kind of say, okay, now with a developing country, there's a positive aspect of being a developing country. That means some of the things aren't as ingrained. Sure, some prehistorical type things like the tribalism we were talking about might be stronger, but they're not like, okay, we have to pay for things with cash. They're like, no, we just want to pay for things. So if you can show us an easier way to pay for things, we don't necessarily need to go with cash. So that's one of the big things that I'd say as shows how flexible and how much this country can change.
So, I mean, you've spent a long time in the United States. I
Yes.
know I suppose are you working towards citizenship?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely okay with doing dual because now dual is that was allowed from the next when the Constitution was just ratified, I think in 2010, and now they allowed for dual citizenship for
Mhm.
Kenya. So yeah, most of my family, I mean, okay, my relatives are all in Kenya. Most of them, a few of them are here in America, but I'd say family is more people you make, like the friends you make, people you grow up with. So culturally, I think most of the people who I'm close to are here in America, and I think my ideas are more familiar. I'd be more effective here. So yeah,
Mhm.
definitely like the country, would like to live here, and that's what I'm working towards. Yeah.
So in a lot of ways, you're sort of leaving Kenya behind.
No, no, definitely not. I mean, it's part of me, as I said before. It's going to be harder to figure out how to live this international type thing where everything's connected, but that's the challenge I think that makes me happy, and that's my life. You got to embrace your life and look back, and I think be realistic about it. And I can't imagine just being in one location. How it's not what made me. So the ideas I have do connect with my people in
Fair
Europe.
enough. Although I'll argue that as you get older, you might feel differently. I know that's been my experience, but
Okay. I mean, no. If somebody told me to pick one place, I think right now it would be here. I mean, that's
Hmm.
I'm focusing on setting my base, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but I don't have to do that yet. So yeah.
All right, well, I think we covered a lot of the basics, at least. There are probably always questions that are going to pop up. But is there anything that you'd like to add, maybe?
Um. Well, I know we are supposed to talk about Kenya, and we kind of jumped into a bunch of different things.
Yeah.
But,
Well, it was certainly was related. I think um, one thing that maybe we didn't explore enough, maybe we can do that now. I mean, are there actual noticeable distinctions between, say, West Africa and East Africa? I'm not talking genetically, there are obviously, but I'm
yes.
talking about sort of culturally and just the way things are run that occur to you. And if not, that's fine as well.
Well, I can't. I don't think I can speak too much on that, as I haven't really been anywhere in Africa besides Kenya.
Mm,
So
right.
I haven't really seen much of it. But actually, I know we kind of got in touch a few weeks ago, and to set this up, and I was telling you that some things did come of interest. Might need a separate show to discuss it. Just
Yeah.
some
Yeah.
more MGTOW related, relationship related things, which I was
Yeah.
kind of looking into, which I think would be a
Well,
lot
I
of
mean,
interest.
here's an interesting question, I think. So
Yeah,
you're, I guess, a proper African, whatever that means.
yeah,
Yet, they're in the United States, most of the black population is mixed, say genetically. They're also, they've been in the United States for centuries.
yes.
Um, what's your relationship with, say, people of that kind of persuasion?
Okay. Well, okay. I played American football in college
Right.
also, and that's why I went to West Virginia, and that's the first time I actually got to really befriend a lot of people from, I guess, what would typically be called the African American community in
Mm,
America, because the school I went to was in the suburbs of DC, more like the international community area.
right.
Most of my school was first generation or actual born abroad from all the international organizations, the NGOs, the UNs, these kind of things, government, and etc. So there weren't that many. The black people there were mostly actual Africans. It wasn't really even African Americans. There was a few, but not that many. Um, so I got to school, and there was some people. People get the scholarships, and they were coming from the inner city area of Washington D.C. And I was living in the suburbs of Washington D.C. So I got there, and of course, growing up, there was that general teasing of people saying, "Oh, you're an Oreo, this and this." That's the whole black outside, white on the inside.
Mm,
Kind of just general ribbing. I'd call my Asian friends Twinkies, who were yellow on the outside, white on the inside. People
right.
I'm still really good friends with to this day. Um, and one of one of the things I noticed was, just as I discussed in Kenya, when you go and they're like, "That's your tribesperson." This happens a lot especially with the women now. The women say, "Okay, I'm of this tribe. That man is of this tribe, so that's kind of our man." I got to college, and it was some kind of it seemed to be some kind of unsaid thing that the black women there had some kind of ownership. Like, as a black person, I had to be attracted to them somehow.
Mm, right.
Where if the black males would go with, whether it was the American ones or me as a foreigner, um, they seem to be some kind of assumption with that, and that's something that. Um, but you see, you pointed out also in the alt-right. I don't know, we can define that as alt-right, but they also have the whole thing like the white women's are ours, our women's are ours.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
I think that's a general thing. So I think that's always there. One
Yeah, but
experience.
it strikes me as, I mean, based on the little I've studied of this, black women uniquely seem to have this notion of sort of ownership of black men.
Yeah,
If you look at some of the dating data and information available, um, other women are just sort of, they just go for white men in general, but only black women I've seen make statements effective, our man or my man or whatever, things of that nature.
yeah,
I don't really see that degree of possessiveness, at least across sort of ethnic racial lines, in other ethnic populations. I don't know where it ultimately stems from off the top of my head, but it is interesting, and I do think it seems somewhat distinct. I'm
Yeah.
sure some of my audience who've grown up in black communities might be able to say more about that, but that's been my observation.
And that's another thing why there's a lot of reasons I'm not done with Kenya, but that's part of the things I'm trying to pick up on and see what's do those kind of tribal delineations still exist in Kenya to that extent? Of course, it will in the places where people don't move that much, but does it play out in Nairobi where the tribes are mixed? And from what I've seen from the people my age in my age group that are getting married, uh, doesn't quite. You see, it goes to the similar thing where when you're just dating, you just date. But then now when it comes to we're gonna go pay the dowry, we're gonna how are we gonna raise our kids? What's the culture? Once it becomes a marriage, now someone will be like, okay, I can date. I'm Christian. I can date a Jewish person. But when we get married, what are we gonna do?
Mm.
So I think that's kind of the situation that happens where the tribes might date anyone, but then when it comes down to it, you're going to take this woman to meet your mother. And your mother might be from a generation where there's still some very, very, very ingrained racial biases or tribal biases, which actually play out in funny ways. Certain jobs, certain fields of work, actually, this is just majority lawyer tribe, like security guards, majority lawyer tribe.
Mm.
Like housemaids would be majority this. It's a weird type thing how that plays out, but that's another whole conversation. Um, so there's that aspect where there's that kind of ownership. Now, another thing I would say is I don't think it's necessarily. I think it's a lot more cultural than it is innate in the people. Because
Mm.
one experience I remember, this kid Kim Page, he no okay, so name I shouldn't say the name, but he came into our school senior year and he played football on the team, and I was one of the few black kids on the team. He was from a more say lower income area in the county I was in, so he was more I'd say hood by definition. I don't know a better term to use. And after the whole football season, we kind of started talking, be playing on a team together. You're getting to know each other more. Towards the end of the season, he kind of came to the end of the school year. We were in the gym working out, and he comes up to me and he shakes my hand and he just says, like, Silas, like when I first came here, I really hated you, but you're really cool, and that's kind of something I noticed where I don't know if it was just more him, but from that experience where you've had someone where he actually got to know you, got past these biases and social aspects, like, okay, this person's with white people, and he said that about a lot of other people on the team because he came from a place that was being told these people are against you or you're being held
Mm.
back by these kind of people. And that's something I fought with during that time. I think a lot more after traveling around the world and trying to figure out, okay, now you're just an African. You're no longer here in this country because your parents are working here. How are you going to find your place as an African in this massive world? Especially with my intention to kind of do something more than just be in one place. So it took me a long time to realize that a lot of these divisions, there's definitely the clear ones, the clear genetic divisions. IQ, there's differences in things we eat, things we like, but in my experience, I don't know how to quite put it right. A lot of
What?
those divisions are more horizontal, where they say the people on the top are against everyone on the below. But I think I like that chart that kind of has it vertical, where it says like these people think in the same way, but they can be on different levels. They can be black people, they can be rich, they can be this. But thought wise, I think is
Yeah.
more the division that I see in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's a pretty interesting summary of things.
I hope it made some sense.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. Okay. Well, maybe if topics remain sort of outstanding and need to be covered, we can certainly cover it on a separate occasion. But
That would be amazing if we could.
some uh, some insight into Kenya, I think, for the audience at the very least. and if only the basic geography of the place.
Yeah.
But well, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you.
And to my audience, thanks for tuning in. And check you out at a later date. Everyone, take care, and thanks for watching. Bye bye.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.